Good afternoon, and welcome to the Jewish community of Sedona and the Verde Valley, the JCSVV, and our Adult Jewish Education Committee. My name is Sheldon Hirsch, and I will present today's program titled The Synagogue, From Antiquity to Modernity. This course is divided into 3 sessions. Today's first session explores the beginning of the synagogue in antiquity and ends in the Middle Ages. This program was created under a Creative Commons license. It is a non-commercial presentation solely for educational purposes. I have included a bibliography at the end of the presentation. So let's begin. Synagogues are all the same, and synagogues are all different. Synagogues have the same Torah, Ark, and Bima, yet each synagogue reflects the congregation that built it and the era in which it was built. The model for the synagogue was born at Mount Sinai more than 3,000 years ago. The story of the synagogue is the story of the Jewish people. To understand the synagogue, we have to start at the beginning. Here is a short video, an overview of today's session.
All around the world, synagogues are an integral part of Judaism. From the Greek meaning place of assembly, the synagogue today is referred to as a house of prayer, house of assembly, house of study, and in some cases even temple. While this institution's recent 2,000 years of history can be tracked relatively easily, its origins are still a bit of a mystery. There are no mentions of synagogues in the Old Testament of the Bible, so it's commonly believed that synagogues must have developed after the destruction of Solomon's temple in 586 BC. The reasoning goes that once robbed of the central element of the Jewish faith, the priests of Judah began teaching, reading, and studying Torah. Buildings, perhaps homes, were refurbished to facilitate this, and soon the synagogue, the assembly of faithful Jews observant to the covenant, became a cornerstone in Jewish society. One of the obvious benefits being that any community, despite their geographical location or distance from Jerusalem, could have their own synagogue. The earliest mention of synagogues may come from a 3rd century BC Egyptian inscription. Beyond this, by the 1st century AD, synagogues were a part of normal Jewish life, receiving mentions by Philo of Alexandria, Flavius Josephus, the New Testament, and rabbinic literature. Amazingly, just south of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, the Theodotus inscription was found. It once adorned a synagogue that lived practically in the shadow of the temple, demonstrating that the two establishments were not competitive. The inscription tells us that synagogues had been around for some time, they were used for studying the scriptures, as a hostel, and they kept water for Jewish purification rituals. Early synagogues seem not to have been associated with prayer, likely because of the temple's scriptural role as a house of prayer. The temple's destruction by Rome in AD 70 changed the function and focus of synagogues. Without a place for sacrifice, festivals, and prayer, the people turned to their synagogues and emphasized what they could do to follow God, the sacrifices of studying scripture and praying 3 times a day to correspond to the times sacrifices used to be made at the temple. The temple had been destroyed before, and Judaism had been able to maintain a strong religious culture. Interestingly, the Torah Ark, the shelved box in which a synagogue's scriptures were kept, were also directly influenced by the destruction of the temple. As synagogues changed to preserve the memory of the temple, the Torah Ark was treated to represent the Holy of Holies, called an Ark to reference the Ark of the Covenant, decorated with temple motifs and sometimes flanked with curtains, as was the temple's Holy of Holies. The orientation of the seating benches also shifted from a central focus to a Torah shrine focus, which was normally located on the Jerusalem-facing wall.
In its more than 3,000-year history, Judaism has gifted the world with remarkable innovations. First and foremost is monotheism, the idea that there was only one universal God who created heaven and earth. Judaism gave the world Shabbat, the idea that all living beings, including slaves and animals, deserve a day of rest each week was revolutionary. Jews gave the world Torah, with its eternal search for truth, social justice, and morality. And Jews gave the world the synagogue, the oldest surviving religious building type in the Western Hemisphere, spanning a history of 2,500 years. In the synagogue, Judaism created a new religious experience where worshipers read sacred scriptures, prayed, and formed a community with God. Later Christian churches and Muslim mosques are modeled on this ancient Jewish innovation. The word synagogue is Greek and means a gathering place or place of assembly. Early synagogues were the first buildings where people worshiped without idols. The ancient synagogue did not have sacrifices. The synagogue is many things. A synagogue is a house of assembly, a Beit Knesset. Since ancient times, synagogues served as a meeting place and town hall for the Jewish community. It's a place to celebrate holidays and life cycle events like a wedding or bris. The ancient synagogue held court proceedings, community archives and treasuries, communal meals, and lodging for travelers, and benefited the whole community. A synagogue is also a house of study, a Beit Midrash. It is a place where children and adults receive Jewish education, including Torah and Jewish law. A synagogue is also a house of prayer, a Beit Tefillah for Jewish communal prayer. A Jew can pray anywhere, anytime, but certain prayers require a minyan of 10 Jewish adults. The synagogue is a place of charity, a social welfare agency. Synagogues had chevras, or committees, to care for the poor and for orphans, brides, and travelers. There are committees to visit the sick, like our own Bikur Cholim committee, and committees to bury the dead, the Chevra Kadisha. The synagogue is also a place of safety. In the diaspora, the synagogue was a refuge for Jews against attacks. In Eastern Europe, medieval synagogues were built as fortresses to protect against invaders, peasant uprising, anarchy, and anti-Semitic events. Throughout our past, the synagogue filled many community needs and functioned as a Jewish community center, an ancient JCC. The synagogue has several names. Orthodox and Hasidic Jews use the Yiddish word shul, from the German word for school, which suggests a Beit Midrash. Conservative Jews usually use the word synagogue, which suggests a Beit Knesset. Reform Jews use the word temple. Their meeting place is considered the replacement for the ancient temple, which suggests a Beit Tefillah. Now we begin our story. Here in red is the Levant, which is the eastern Mediterranean shore or the Middle East. To the west is Egypt. To the northeast is Mesopotamia, now modern-day Iraq. And here is the land of Israel. Anyone traveling from Europe or Asia to Egypt and North Africa had to go through the land of Israel. God put the land of Israel at the crossroads of ancient world history. Here our story of the Jewish people begin. After many years of captivity, Moses led the Hebrews out of slavery in Egypt and into the desert wilderness of Sinai. There, at Mount Sinai, about the year 1300 BCE, before the Common Era, the 12 tribes of Israel received the 10 Commandments and the Torah. In the Torah's book of Exodus, God gave Moses detailed instructions on how to build the sanctuary and all its furnishings. They shall make for me a sanctuary, and I will dwell among them. This is the commandment in the book of Exodus, to build the Mishkan, or tabernacle, and later the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. God's sanctuary in the desert wilderness was called the Mishkan, or tabernacle. The Hebrew word Mishkan means to dwell, and the tabernacle was where God's presence dwelled. It was portable, and the people carried it with them while wandering in the desert for 40 years. The Mishkan was the template for Solomon's temple in Jerusalem and the ancestor of all synagogues. The tabernacle, or Mishkan, was a tent-like structure built with gold, fine fabrics, and animal skins. When the Hebrews camped in the desert, the Mishkan was in the center of the camp, with the 12 tribes camped around it. The Mishkan was surrounded by a gated fence enclosing a courtyard. Inside the courtyard was an altar for sacrifices and a wash basin for priests. The Mishkan door faced east.
The tabernacle was divided into three main courts: the outer court, the holy place, and the Holy of Holies. The outer court represented the fallen world, while the inner courts represented a more sacred and holier way of life. In essence, as the priest, who represented all of Israel, progressed through the tabernacle, or temple, he left the world to enter a more holy state, and then was enabled to re-enter the presence of the Lord, passing the angels, or cherubim, who were embroidered on the veil.
Here is the floor plan of the Mishkan. The enclosed courtyard contained an altar for sacrifices and a wash basin for priests. The two rooms of the Mishkan were divided by a curtain of blue, purple, and scarlet. In the outer room, the holy place, there was a table with 12 loaves of bread, the shewbread, one for each tribe. Shewbread was an offering to God. There was also an altar for incense and a menorah. Inside the Holy of Holies was the Ark of the Covenant, topped with two angelic cherubim. The ark was covered with gold, and it held the stone tablets of the 10 Commandments. The Mishkan had 3 levels of holiness. The first level was the enclosed courtyard, which was the boundary between the sacred and the profane realm. The second level was the sanctuary's holy place. And the third level was the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant was housed. This 3-level progression of holiness, which was created 3,000 years ago in the Sinai wilderness, was the template for the future Jerusalem temple and all future synagogues. After conquering the land of Israel, the Israelites still used the portable Mishkan for about 300 years, until King Solomon built the first temple in Jerusalem in 957 BCE. Solomon's temple was the first permanent home for the ark, and it was a place of assembly for the entire people. As described in the book of Prophets, Solomon's temple was essentially a stone version of the Mishkan. It was a rectangular building that faced east. It had a large courtyard with a sacrificial altar and a large bowl for the priest's cleansing rituals. At the entrance to Solomon's temple were 2 large pillars topped with large pomegranates. These 2 pillars and pomegranates will reappear in synagogue construction in popular folklore 3,000 years later in our next programs.
At the front of the temple were 2 large bronze pillars that flanked the porch. The pillar on the left was named Boaz, and the pillar on the right was named Yakin. The tops were decorated with lily flower petals and pomegranates. Pomegranates were a sign of prosperity and posterity because of their many seeds, and were also found on the bottom hem of the clothing of the high priest.
This is the floor plan of Solomon's temple. The temple had 3 rooms: the vestibule, the main room, or holy place for religious service, and the Holy of Holies, which contained the Ark with the 10 Commandments. Let's compare the floor plan of Solomon's temple to the floor plan of Moses' Mishkan. As with the original Mishkan, the temple's physical layout produced a 3-level progression of holiness. One proceeded from the vestibule, the first level, into the main holy place, the second level, and then into the Holy of Holies, the third level, which was only entered by the high priest once a year on Yom Kippur, similar to the Mishkan. This side-by-side cutaway compares the layout of Solomon's temple to Moses' Mishkan. Both structures face east, and both have the same progressive levels of holiness, with the ark always being at the peak. It took centuries to codify this plan, but this 3-level progression of holiness became the blueprint for synagogues throughout the world. This is a photo of the Nozick Synagogue, built in 1902. It is the only synagogue in Warsaw, Poland, to survive the Holocaust. If we look at the floor plan of this typical early 20th century synagogue, we can again see the same three-level progression, beginning at the main entrance at the bottom of the slide, from the vestibule to the main sanctuary to the Torah Ark. We see the same three-level progression in our own JCSVV synagogue. Our synagogue has a rounded exterior, but we still enter through a lobby, then proceed into the main sanctuary where the focus is the Torah Ark. So over centuries, the Mishkan's courtyard has become the synagogue lobby. The Mishkan's holy place has become the main synagogue sanctuary, and the Holy of Holies, which contained the Ark of the Covenant, has become the Torah Ark, the center of synagogue worship. The Mishkan's Holy of Holies had the Word of God chiseled on stone tablets. Today's synagogue ark has the same Word of God written on Torah parchment. The first temple, Solomon's temple, stood almost 400 years, from the 10th century BCE to the 6th century BCE, when it was destroyed by Babylonia. In 586 BCE, Babylonia captured Jerusalem, destroyed Solomon's temple, and took the elite of the Jewish population back into exile in Babylonia. This was the end of the first temple period, which had lasted about 400 years. About 50 years later, in 539 BCE, Persia conquered Babylonia and allowed the exiled Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. Most of the exiles, however, remained in Babylon, where they and their descendants formed the early diaspora, which is a community of Jews living outside Judea. The Second Temple was completed in 515 BCE, about 25 years after the Babylonian exiles' return. It was only a modest version of the original building. The First Temple was built at the height of Solomon's wealthy and powerful kingdom. But the Second Temple was built by exiles returning to a devastated land. It did not have the original Ark of the Covenant or the ritual objects of the First Temple, which had been lost. 200 years later, in 332 BCE, Alexander the Great conquered Israel, along with Greece, Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa, and began Hellenization of the area with Greek philosophy, math, science, and art. Another 200 years later, in 63 BCE, Rome entered Israel. In 20 BCE, the modest Second Temple was magnificently rebuilt by King Herod, who was a vassal king appointed by Rome. The temple and the Temple Mount were enlarged and surrounded by a retaining wall, which we now call the Western Wall. The inner courtyard contained a sacrificial altar and a water basin for cleansing. The temple building again had two large pillars flanking the gate to the entrance hall. The entrance hall led to the main sanctuary, which then led to the Holy of Holies, which was a progression of holiness similar to the Mishkan and Solomon's temple. As described in the Mishnah and by Jewish historians, Herod's temple was magnificent, and it was the center of Israelite life and religion. The first Jewish rebellion against Rome began in 66 CE, the Common Era, and ended with the destruction of the temple on Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, in 70 CE. This ended the Second Temple period, which had lasted about 600 years. The first and second temples in Jerusalem had been the center of Jewish religion for 1,000 years, from the time of Solomon in the 10th century BCE to its destruction by the Romans in the 1st century CE. The sudden disappearance of the temple was a tragedy of awesome dimensions. This was a new Jewish world without temple, priests, or animal sacrifices. The stage is now set for the synagogue to fill this void. There are archaeologic remains of more than 100 synagogues in the land of Israel and at least 150 synagogues throughout the diaspora, but no one really knows when the first synagogue came into being. Babylonia conquered Israel and destroyed the first temple in the 6th century BCE. The earliest synagogues may have developed during that Babylonian exile. In the book of Psalms, Psalm 137 says, "By the rivers of Babylon, the exiled Jews wept and remembered Zion. There the wicked carried us away and required from us a song. Now how shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land?" And that was the exile's existential question. How do you sing the Lord's song in a strange land? Can you worship God when you are far away from the destroyed temple in Jerusalem? To answer that question, Jews may have set up houses of worship in the Babylonian exile. Having a place for community gatherings and to read scripture would enable Judaism to survive in Babylonia away from the destroyed temple in Jerusalem. When the exiles returned to Israel 50 years later, they probably brought the idea of a community gathering place, the embryonic synagogue, back with them. Even while the Second Temple was standing, Jews in the diaspora lived too far away to travel to Jerusalem to worship. By year 0, Jews were already living in Spain, France, Rome, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and North Africa. And after the 2 Roman wars and Bar Kokhba revolt in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, Jews were further dispersed across the Mediterranean basin, and many were taken to Rome as slaves. So to answer this need, Jews created this special community gathering place, the synagogue, and designated it with sanctity. It was a place where people could worship locally, and synagogues spread all over the ancient world and the land of Israel. The first synagogue probably came into being after the destruction of the first temple during the Babylonian exile, and after the destruction of the second temple in 70 CE. The synagogue became the dominant worldwide Jewish institution. This map of modern Israel will orient us for the next slides. We see the Sea of Galilee, the blue water in the north, and the Jordan River leading south to the Dead Sea. The Galilee is in the north, and the Golan is the lighter color in the northeast. Jerusalem is in the middle, and the Mediterranean is on the left. After the 2 Roman wars, Judea, in the middle of the country, was decimated, and the remaining Jewish population moved north to the Galilee and the Golan, where the remains of 50 synagogues have been identified. After the Roman wars, northern Israel, the Galilee, became the center of Jewish life. It is an ancient custom for synagogues to acknowledge gifts with a plaque or inscription identifying the donor. Ancient dedication inscriptions like this one are the earliest evidence for the existence of synagogues. Most are written in Greek, Aramaic, or Hebrew. The most important evidence for an early synagogue in the land of Israel while the temple was still standing is this dedication inscription in Greek found close to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem.
Because synagogues have a tremendous amount of their vertical real estate devoted to plaques of various kinds. So-and-so donated the money for this, so-and-so dedicated the money for this, and things like that. And that's really a very old tradition in Judaism. If you look at this example here, this is the so-called Theodotos inscription, which is about 2,000 years old, the very oldest inscription, dedicatory plaque really, discovered in a synagogue. It was found in Jerusalem. The text reads in Greek, which is significant, Theodotos, son of Venitus, priest and head of the synagogue, right? He's a Kohen, and he is the archi-synagogus, meaning he's like the president of the shul. Kohen, and at the same time president of the shul. Son of a head of the synagogue, and grandson of a head of the synagogue. He's got tremendous yichus going back 2 generations of shul presidents. Built the synagogue for the reading of the Torah and the teaching of the commandments, as well as the guest room, the chambers, the water fittings, as an inn for those in need from abroad, the synagogue which his fathers founded with the elders, and Simonides. So I'm not sure who Simonides is and why he's at the very end of the description, but nevertheless, this is like a typical plaque. It says who paid for it and refers to prior generations and says what was dedicated in particular. Here's another one from Susia in southern Judea, 4 centuries later. Just sometimes they're expressed in mosaics and so on, but basically this is a really old thing. Pretty much as long as we have had synagogues, we have had plaques. They go together. It's also
Another ancient dedication inscription found in modern-day Turkey identifies a woman who dedicated funds to the synagogue and who also was an archisynagogos, the president of the synagogue. These inscriptions show that the synagogue and the Jerusalem temple did not compete with each other and that women were able to participate in synagogue activities. Note that this Theodotus inscription does not mention synagogue prayer. While the Second Temple stood, the focus of the ancient synagogue was Torah study, teaching, celebrating Shabbat and holidays, and gathering for communal meetings, not for prayer. It is difficult to identify synagogues built before the Second Temple was destroyed in 70 CE, because until the 2nd or 3rd centuries CE, synagogues had no specific Jewish architectural details or a permanent Torah ark. Early synagogues were probably private homes or buildings modified for Jewish worship. We can identify ancient synagogues by finding dedication inscriptions, fragments of sacred scrolls, a mikveh or Jewish ritual bath, a menorah, or other Jewish symbols. The most common Jewish symbols during Antiquity were the menorah and the Torah shrine. Beginning in the 3rd century CE, the menorah was used in synagogue decorations, mosaic pavements, door frames, and columns. Here is a menorah carved into a column and another menorah carved onto the side of a stone, while others are freestanding. By the 3rd century CE, the rabbinic sages were the religious elite. The rabbis saw the synagogue as a substitute for the destroyed temple. They formulated a new Judaism centered around the synagogue. Instead of priestly sacrifices, synagogue Judaism now revolved around Torah study, public prayer, and acts of kindness. We recall that on every Shabbat during the Torah service, our Rabbi Magal reads these words from our Siddur. The world is sustained by 3 things: Torah, worship, and loving deeds. It was at this time, following the destruction of the Second Temple, that these words entered Judaism. Synagogue prayer became a replacement for temple sacrifices. The rabbis established 3 daily prayer services at the same times when sacrifices used to take place in the temple. Some temple rituals were transferred directly to the synagogue, like blowing the shofar and the priestly blessing, and the Torah remained in scroll form, just like in the destroyed temple. The Torah became the Jews' portable homeland in exile, and the synagogue was their miniature temple. In addition to being a Beit Midrash, a house of study, and a Beit Knesset, a house of assembly, after the destruction of the Second Temple, the synagogue now also became a Beit Tefillah, a house of prayer. Wherever there was a Jewish community, a synagogue and prayer were established. The Bar Kokhba revolt and the Second Roman War took place in the 2nd century CE. On the map behind Dr. Henry Abramson are listed the Hebrew names of many Jewish settlements that were already in existence by the 2nd century CE, from Persian Shushan in the east, where the Purim story unfolded, to Spanish Cordoba in the west, where Sephardic Jewry flourished. Each of these settlements had at least one and probably many synagogues. Aramaic was the dominant language of the age. Aramaic uses Hebrew letters, but the vocabulary and grammar are different, sort of like English is to French. As knowledge of Hebrew declined, Torah reading was assigned to an expert reader. The first paid synagogue official was the translator, who translated the Hebrew Torah into Aramaic so the congregation could understand it. After the 6th century, the title Chazan was taken by the synagogue leader, who had to understand Hebrew, Torah, prayers, and have musical abilities. A Gabbai became synagogue treasurer. Antiquity is broken into two time periods. Early antiquity is the time when the classical civilizations of Greece and Rome were flourishing, and extends to about the 3rd century CE. Late antiquity begins with the decline of Roman civilization and extends from about the 3rd century CE to about the 7th century CE, when the Middle Ages began. By late antiquity, synagogues were spread throughout the land of Israel. Note, there are a large number of synagogues in the northern Galilee and Golan, but few synagogues in the middle of the country, in Judea and Jerusalem, where Rome had killed, exiled, or enslaved most of the Jews. After the Second Roman War, Rome renamed the area Palestine to further blot out the name Judea. In the Jerusalem temple, worshippers stood passively in the courtyard, watching priests perform sacrifices. But with the synagogue, worshippers now were inside the sanctuary and actively participated in services. So the synagogue required an interior space large enough for its congregation. The model for the early synagogue was an ancient Roman public building called a basilica. The basilica predates Christianity. Here is a photo of what a large Roman basilica looked like. It was a rectangular building with 3 entrance doors on one of the short walls. It had a large central aisle, separated from 2 side aisles by rows of columns, which supported a second-floor gallery. The Roman basilica had a raised apse or niche or bump out on the wall opposite the entrance door. This is where the Roman judges sat. On the right is a floor plan of the basilica. We see the rows of columns and the apse or bump out at the top. This floor plan was ideally suited to our 3-level progression of holiness. It already had a vestibule, a large indoor sanctuary, and an apse or bump out, which later became the Torah shrine or Torah ark. Jewish law regulates the interior design of the synagogue, but there are few specific requirements for the building's external appearance. Any building, or part of a building, even one room, can serve as a synagogue. Synagogues were usually built in the local architectural style of the time period. Here is what the Talmud says about synagogue construction. A synagogue should be the tallest building in the city, built on the highest point in the city. But Christianity and Islam, however, frequently imposed restrictions on the size and height of the synagogue building and compelled the building to be inconspicuous. A synagogue should have windows, preferably 12. In the book of Daniel, Daniel prayed by windows, and there are 12 tribes of Israel. A synagogue should be oriented towards Jerusalem. Daniel and King Solomon prayed towards Jerusalem, and the destroyed temple was in Jerusalem. One should first go through a vestibule or lobby before entering the main sanctuary. In the vestibule, thoughts and cares of the outer world are shed before entering the holiness of the inner sanctuary. Over centuries, a general plan for the synagogue building slowly evolved. A rectangular building, paved with flagstone, with the Torah ark at the eastern end, a bima in the center, benches along the walls, and a women's gallery reached by staircases from the vestibule. As in this picture, they often had a richly decorated facade facing Jerusalem, so the community was reminded of the Second Temple and its destruction. It had 3 doors with windows above the doors. The facade of the 2-storied building held a triangular pediment and arch above the door. Many synagogues had a courtyard with a fountain or wash basin to clean one's hands. The houses of the local villages were built with rubble or uncut fieldstones, but the synagogue was usually built with massive, carefully cut stones or ashlars. no two synagogue buildings were identical in size, shape, or design. By the 4th century CE, the basilica had become the most common architectural style for Jewish synagogues and Christian churches. The most important element of the synagogue was the Torah Ark. It became the main architectural feature of the interior and the focal point of the synagogue. The Ark contained the Torah scrolls and symbolized the original Ark of the Covenant in the Mishkan and in Solomon's temple. To protect the Torah scrolls, ornate stone and wooden cabinets were built, which became the Torah Ark, the Aron Kodesh. The name Ark is actually an acrostic. It is made up of the Hebrew words for Aron Kodesh, which mean holy cabinet. We join the AR of the Aron to the K of Kodesh to form the new word Ark. In some early synagogues, the Torah Ark, or Torah shrine, was portable, in memory of the portable biblical Ark of the Covenant in the wilderness. The photo on the left shows a carved stone from the ancient synagogue, which shows a portable Torah shrine with wheels. I have circled the carved Torah shrine, to highlight the artist's reconstruction. The portable shrine has 5 pillars and the roof is curved, and the wheels are visible at the bottom of the stone. The Torah scrolls were probably stored in another room or outside the building and brought into the sanctuary on Shabbat and festivals. By the 4th or 5th century CE, the Torah Ark became permanently fixed in a specially constructed apse or niche or alcove on the wall facing Jerusalem. Sometimes, the Torah Ark was placed in a small independent shrine called an aedicula, which was flanked with columns and richly decorated. The idea for the aedicula was borrowed from ancient Roman temples and household shrines. The Torah Ark was usually decorated and raised on a platform reached by steps. Separate compartments inside the Ark cabinet held the individual Torah scrolls. Here we see menorahs carved on the top of the front columns. The bima is the second most important element in the synagogue interior. The Hebrew word bima means platform and refers to both the raised platform from which the Torah is read, and it also refers to the actual reading table itself. The bima symbolizes the sacrificial altars in the Mishkan and the Jerusalem temple. But instead of animal sacrifices on the temple altar, Jews now read Torah on the synagogue bima. The altar was in the center of the temple courtyard, so the bima was placed in the center of the synagogue. Sometimes the bima was joined to the platform in front of the ark, and steps were added to the platform, as it is in our own JCSVV synagogue. At the bima, one can lead services, read Torah, or give sermons or lectures. The sanctity of the synagogue is second only to the ancient temple. The Torah is the most sacred object in the synagogue, and the closer objects are to the Torah, the greater their degree of holiness. So, the ark, which holds the Torah, has greater sanctity than the bima, which is further away. A Beit Midrash, or house of study, has more sanctity than a Beit Knesset, a house of assembly, because Torah is studied in the Beit Midrash. Ancient synagogues were lit with oil lamps such as these. The 2 lamps on the left are made of clay and have a menorah and a Torah shrine in the middle. The one on the right is made of metal, and its handle is a menorah. Additionally, there were probably large lamps or menorahs on a synagogue floor. The Torah does not mention the synagogue because the synagogue did not exist when the Torah was given at Mount Sinai. So the rules for Torah behavior were derived from other ancient sources, including the Talmud, the Shulchan Aruch, the Book of Prophets, and Maimonides. In a synagogue, people must be respectful, and certain behaviors are not permitted. In a synagogue, there's no transacting business except for charity or the redemption of captives. No disreputable or criminal activities in a synagogue building. You cannot have a gambling den on the roof or in the basement. You can't enter a synagogue just to get out of the rain. You can't hang laundry or come in with an unsheathed knife. You cannot take a shortcut through a synagogue. No gossiping, eating, drinking, putting on makeup, sleeping, or napping in the synagogue, and no rubbish can be collected in the synagogue. Hidur mitzvah is a concept from the Talmud that a mitzvah or commandment is elevated by making it more beautiful. Therefore, because the synagogue was devoted to worshiping God, it should be decorated in a very beautiful manner. Ancient synagogues often had colored and decorated walls, which have now faded. Above is the Arch of Titus in Rome, and below is the carved stone wall relief depicting Roman soldiers carrying off the menorah and other treasures stolen from the Jerusalem temple after the First Roman War. The top photo is how we are used to seeing it, but using modern science and computers, we see how vibrant it looked 2,000 years ago with color. Similarly, ancient synagogue walls may have looked like this, vibrant with color. In the book of Exodus, the second commandment states, "You shall not make for yourself a sculptured image or any likeness of what is in the heavens above, or on the earth below, or in the waters under the earth." This commandment prohibits the depiction of living creatures to protect Jews from idolatry. But Jewish attitudes about what was appropriate for the synagogue varied over the centuries. Judaism has never been completely without images or figures. Art, depicting people and animals, has existed throughout Jewish history, from ancient burial sites to medieval manuscripts. During late antiquity, interior synagogue decorations and colorful mosaics were common. Mosaics have existed for thousands of years. Romans used them in bathhouses, marketplaces, temples, and private homes, where it conveyed wealth and prestige. Jews adapted Roman, Byzantine, and Christian symbols for their own purposes. For Jews, these images had no sacred quality. As long as it could be walked upon, the influence of idolatry would be neutralized. By the 2nd century CE, most synagogue floors were paved with flagstones or with simple mosaics made of small cut stone cubes. By the 4th century CE, animals and people were introduced into the mosaics, along with geometric and floral designs, biblical scenes, and Jewish symbols. Here is a 4th century mosaic found in the Severus Synagogue in northern Israel. Between the 4th and 7th centuries CE, in late antiquity, the astrologic zodiac was a popular decoration in ancient synagogues.
We have some examples of archaeological remains of ancient synagogues. Here's one that's absolutely fascinating to me. This is a little bit later, and it dates from the period that we are focused on. It's located in a place called Hamat Tiberia, the hot springs of Tiberias, which is in the north, and it dates from the 4th century. Now, if you look at this is an aerial view. There's some kind of like wall that was constructed that bisects, unfortunately, this gorgeous floor mosaic. And on top of it is this interesting kind of panel or register. Let's bring this up here. And it has 3 centuries after the destruction of the temple. It has all of these symbols hearkening back to the temple. Has a depiction of the Ark of the Covenant. Has incense shovels, which would be unfamiliar to the Jews in the 4th century because this particular form of worship ended with the temple's destruction. It has, of course, a shofar blown on Rosh Hashanah, and the menorah, a perennial symbol of Judaism. So they're still thinking of the synagogue as a mikdash ma'at, as a small sanctuary, some kind of like echo of the temple, which is the way Jews think of it even to this day. Looking at the zodiac that is in the floor, however, this is just bizarre, right? First of all, very beautiful artwork, very realistic, a high example of 4th century Byzantine art. And you see the four seasons around the outside, and you've got all of the the 12 signs of the zodiac labeled in Hebrew. A certain amount of nudity, which is somehow shocking, but we also see it in the Dura Europos synagogue. I'll show you that later. Not necessarily nudity, but the Dura Europos synagogue. But what's going on in the center there? You have what really looks like Helios, the sun god, which is a typical representation in non-Jewish zodiacs, where you have the 12 signs of the zodiac surrounding the sun god. How is this possible in a Jewish house of worship? And especially because for much of this period, Jews tended to be very aniconic, meaning when they portrayed artwork, it was typically decorative in nature, using geometrical symbols and patterns rather than, depictions of the human form. So theories are still being developed as to what's going on here, but perhaps one of the most significant or more convincing theories is that Jews didn't look at this like it was the god Helios. They looked at it as if it was a representation of the sun. That's just the convention. When you want to display the sun, you display like a guy sitting there with his face shining. And it's not like they took it seriously as, oh, there's Helios, the sun god. They would say, oh, isn't this a beautiful, you've got the sun and all these other things around it. You can be convinced or not, but if you have a better idea, put it in the comment box. Here is another example of a zodiac, not nearly as beautiful, I think, from the Beit Alpha synagogue. Dates a little bit later. You can see that the artwork is, I think, a little bit more primitive in nature, but very similar kind of decorative elements. And you see, of course, Helios with his 4 horses, and so we have multiple examples of this kind of convention. This is also a mosaic from Beit Alpha, which has a very, very stark kind of representation of the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. You see that on the far right there is the patriarch Abraham, and he's holding a slaughtering knife, and he's about to place his son Isaac, labeled in Hebrew, on the flames, and he's after slaughtering him. But there is, in the center towards the top, there is a hand that reaches out from heaven, which is also fascinating because, if Jews are traditionally aniconic and they don't like representing animals or humans as a result of the 10 Commandments, then they certainly don't represent God, but nevertheless, here it is. There's some question about who was the artist who produced this. Is it possible you had Christian artists who are doing this work? But if that's the case, the Jews are paying for this art for their synagogue, right? So how are they authorizing it? Lots of fascinating questions. At any rate, under the hand, it says in Hebrew, al tishlach, do not send out your hand against the boy, and so on. And you can see, all kinds of things happen. Hine ayel, here's the ram that's tied to the bush, and so on. Fascinating stuff.
The zodiac mosaics had Hebrew names for the 12 zodiac signs and could be a Jewish adaptation of the pagan zodiac to depict the Jewish calendar. For example, this is part of a Rosh Chodesh handout from our JCSVV synagogue, mimicking the calendar-like layout of the zodiac. Here, the Hebrew and English months are arranged around the Star of David instead of the sun god. In the 5th century CE, as the threat from Christianity increased, Jewish images became more conservative. And by the 6th century CE, synagogue art no longer had figures or images. And in some synagogues, the zodiac images were removed. Visitors to Herod's Jerusalem temple entered by a set of triple gates, a large gate in the middle and 2 smaller gates on either side. Here are 2 illustrations of the triple gates. Centuries later, Jews recall these triple gates by building synagogue entrances with triple gates. Here we see in the upper left-hand corner a synagogue in Romania. Next to it, Miami Beach. Next to it is the National Synagogue in Washington, D.C. The bottom left is Central Synagogue in New York City. Then there's one from Hungary, and we see one from Kaifeng, China. Jewish merchants and traders lived in Kaifeng, China for hundreds of years. And here is an illustration of their synagogue in the early 18th century. Note that there are 3 doors to enter the first courtyard, another 3 doors to enter the next courtyard, before entering the 3 doors to the actual synagogue. In Judaism, a gate is a portal between the sacred and the profane, between heaven and earth, and between life and death. And the gate of heaven is the place where our prayers ascend. After the temple was destroyed, the significance of gates increased. For example, here is Beit She'arim necropolis with its 3 gates, reminiscent of the temple's 3 gates. Cut into the rocky hills of the Galilee in northern Israel, this is the largest ancient Jewish cemetery in the world. It is now an Israeli national park and a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Judah the Prince, who compiled the Mishnah, was buried here in the 2nd century CE. Just as in Herod's temple, the middle gate is larger and is flanked by 2 smaller gates. Early synagogues had no fixed architectural form. But by late antiquity, synagogues were built in 3 main architectural types. In the 2nd to 3rd centuries, in early antiquity, the basilica without an apse on the left was the dominant style, and the Torah ark did not have a fixed position. By the 5th to 6th century, in late antiquity, the basilica with an apse on the right became the dominant style, and the Torah ark became a fixed part of the synagogue. Sometimes, a plot of land did not allow for a typical synagogue orientation, so a broadhouse synagogue was built, and the Torah ark was placed along the long wall. Note that all 3 types have 3 entrances, similar to the Jerusalem temple. Now we look at early synagogues in the land of Israel. We will look at Gamla, number 1, on the Golan Heights, and Magdala, number 2, in the Galilee. The Masada Synagogue, number 7, is south near the Dead Sea. We may ask, if synagogues are present throughout the land of Israel, why aren't there more archaeological remains? If we look at the list of synagogues on the right, we see how these synagogues were mostly destroyed during the Roman wars. Gamla, a fortress destroyed in 68 AD, the First Roman War. Magdala, destroyed in 68 AD. Kiryat Sefer, village destroyed in 70, the First Roman War, rebuilt and destroyed again in 136 AD, the Second Roman War. The next one, village destroyed in the First and Second Roman War. The next one, Herod built a palace over it. The next one was captured, and the Masada was destroyed. Gamla was an ancient city on the Golan Heights. It was built in the 1st century BCE while the Second Temple was still standing. It was built of local, dark-colored volcanic rock or basalt, and it had interior columns and a flat roof. It was unpaved and surrounded by benches. There was no fixed Torah ark yet, so the focus of the synagogue was in the center of the building, and an artist's reconstruction is below. During the First Roman War, the village of Gamla was a rebel stronghold until it was conquered in 68 CE. Romans used this ballista siege weapon to hurl carved stone balls. And here are some of the 2,000 ballista stones that were found here, the largest number anywhere in the Roman Empire. Here is a man-made breach in the wall, probably made by a battering ram. A ritual bath or mikveh was found next to the synagogue. Now we look at the 1st century synagogue at Magdala in the Galilee.
And now we can turn to the latest discoveries. The historic synagogue of Magdala was discovered in 2009 during a salvage dig conducted by the Israel Antiquities Authority. Magdala was a fishing town that was mentioned in Jewish documents of the period as a major site during the First Jewish-Roman War, and is also mentioned in the New Testament as the home community of Mary Magdalene. The synagogue covers approximately 120 square meters. As in other ancient synagogues, it has stone benches built against the walls. The walls were decorated with elaborately designed and colored frescoes, and the floor is partially made of mosaics. But the most exciting and unique find was the so-called Magdala stone, a carved stone table which shows a 7-branched menorah flanked by a pair of 2-handled jocks and a pair of columns. The obvious question is, what might have been the function of this stone, which lay almost in the center of the synagogue? I think the right answer was given by Mordechai Aviam, professor of the Kinneret College, an expert of archaeology of Galilee. He observed that at the 4 corners of the upper side of the Magdala stone, there are 4 rounded flat areas which served as a base for 4 columns. On these columns there was a stone table, a bima, on which the Torah scrolls were placed.
At Magdala, for the first time, 2 synagogues were found in the same town, only 200 yards apart, while the temple was still functioning in Jerusalem. This shows that Jews in the Galilee needed multiple synagogues for study, reading Torah, and social gatherings. Centuries later, Jewish congregations built grander synagogues, such as this one. Baram is a magnificent, well-preserved synagogue in Upper Galilee, probably built in the 4th to 5th century CE in late Antiquity. The facade faces Jerusalem, and it has a triple entrance. The larger middle entrance has fine stone carvings, and there are 2 smaller entrances on the sides. It had a covered vestibule between the exterior columns and the facade. Inside, it has a wide central aisle and 2 narrower side aisles. The synagogue is made up of finely cut and shaped ashlars and not rubble or uncut stone. The synagogue at Capernaum, built in the 4th or 5th century CE, is also located in the Galilee. This basilica-style synagogue had columns, 2-level benches, and triple entrance doors. There is no fixed Torah shrine, which may still have been portable. Worshippers sat on the benches and faced toward the middle of the synagogue. The unroofed structure attached to the right side of the synagogue is an open atrium. The synagogue was built of white limestone on top of a darker basalt stone foundation, which may have been the foundation of a previous 1st century synagogue. Note the fieldstone and rubble construction of the earlier structure below versus the newer ashlars of the Capernaum synagogue. Here is a 3-dimensional rendering of the Capernaum synagogue. Note the triple entrance and the stone ashlar construction. Next is Ein Keshetot, a synagogue built in the 5th century in the northern Golan. The prominent Torah shrine is an aedicula.
Eric, let's go inside. Lots to see.
Let's take a look. I can't wait. I've heard so much about this place, Yaakov, and now I am here.
Let's see history in our own eyes.
Yes. Wow. Unbelievable. And so well preserved and restored.
Yep.
Just amazing. And look at this.
Right.
This is probably the highlight.
This is the highlight. I would say, when the first archaeologists came to this site, we're talking about the late 1800s.
Yeah.
And then along the years, people kept on coming. There was a big argument. Is this a Jewish place or not? And we're now standing in the synagogue. And synagogue in Hebrew is Bet Knesset, which means the house of gathering. This is the heart of the community. This is where everyone meets, 3 times a day, of course, in the weekend. So this is really the heart of the village. And 2 main things prove to us that this is a synagogue. One, the direction of the prayer. Okay, we're now standing towards Jerusalem.
Yes.
And the second thing, this is the Torah Ark. We have here menorahs on it. We see different Jewish symbols.
Clearly Jewish.
So you understand this is Jewish.
Yeah.
Now, just understand, this was a pile of stone. And several, I would say, crazy archaeologists said there's something here. They put little chips in every stone on the pile, and they were able to create a 3D image of where each piece goes. What this place looked like 1,500 years ago when it was destroyed by an earthquake and the Jews had to leave this village. And here we are, 20 years after they began.
Yeah.
We're standing here. This is what it looked, almost what it looked like 1,500 years ago. And we're standing here. And for me, it's always very moving to stand here as, a Jew, as a Golan resident, and I understand I'm standing here. We have bar mitzvah celebrations here. We have weddings here.
Right.
Every group I have here, we come to pray here. And you're standing praying in front of the arch, and your forefathers were praying here just thousands of years ago.
Yeah, Yaakov, that's amazing. What's also incredible is that where we are standing inside right now, not too long ago, this was rubble. And to be restored bit by bit, block by block, pillar by pillar is just amazing. Give us a little bit more information on the relevance and significance of the Ark and what happened here with the Torah in this section of the synagogue.
So first of all, what you just said, I think, is maybe the essence of Israel. You have history and you have innovation, right? A very vibrant, innovative culture, and it comes together here. The innovation is what is able to create the restoration of this place. When you pray in a synagogue, so the synagogues, back then were the whole community would sit around so they can see each other. It's a little bit different than what we see in some of the synagogues, different traditions today. But this is where the Torah scrolls were.
Wow.
And twice a week, and then on Sabbath, you read from the Torah scrolls, the weekly portion. So everyone is praying towards this direction.
Now we look at 2 synagogues in the diaspora. An outstanding diaspora synagogue is Dura Europos in Syria, which was a Roman military outpost along the Euphrates River. Here is a map showing where it is located.
And when it was discovered, it was actually preserved in a remarkable condition. The reason for this is because the Romans, who were trying to defend this eastern outpost from the Sassanid Persians, had actually taken all of the buildings that were by the wall in particular, ripped off their roofs, and filled them with desert sand as an attempt to fortify the city against the invaders. This was to no avail, but it actually had a really interesting consequence for Jews, in that the Dura Europos synagogue, which was located right by the city walls, was remarkably preserved, especially its gorgeous 29 panels of wall paintings. We know that the synagogue was constructed in the year 245 of the Common Era because, of course, there is a plaque that mentions the names of the donors, right? This is one of the great things about Jewish archaeology, is that the synagogues always have plaques, right? Those inscriptions tell us a lot of things about the synagogue. So let's have a look at that synagogue now. Here you can see the western wall, which has the Aron Kodesh on it. Of course, it is the western wall because we are on the east side of Jerusalem. Here in America, we tend to put our Aron Kodesh on the eastern side to face Jerusalem. And you can just get a sense of what it must have been like to walk into this building with these amazing paintings that covered literally every inch of the wall space. And because of the sand, it was actually preserved for 1,700 years. No light entered in to fade the paintings, although we can see levels of renovation work where some paintings were painted over and slightly adjusted and so on. There's just incredible effervescence and energy in these paintings. Here's a beautiful scene of the temple, and you can see that the figure third from the top right is clearly labeled in Greek as Aaron the priest, and this amazing mural that shows scenes in the life of Moses, which also indicates, fascinatingly, that the Jews of Dura Europos apparently had no compunction about portraying the images of women's faces. Here's a glorious multi-figure representation of the Jews crossing the Red Sea, with Moses shown in several figures. You can notice here, by the way, that the artist clearly has, in some cases, there apparently are two distinct artists that are demonstrated here. One shows very Roman influence, or rather Hellenistic influence, and a lot of the figures are shown in togas, and the other seems to have much more Persian influence, a lot of Persian type clothing and so on. And you see battle scenes going on in Dura Europos, and here's one of my favorites. This is a great image of the humiliation of Haman, who is shown here, who obviously has lost his pants somehow, and he is walking Mordecai in a symbol of great honor, as seen from the book of Esther. So one can only imagine that these remarkable images must have accompanied a sense of awe and celebration and excitement. This just gives us a little sense at the elements of rejoicing that go into this special building we call the synagogue. This space
Dura Europos was a broad house type synagogue with the Torah shrine on the long wall facing Jerusalem. The paintings were meant to teach Jewish history to the synagogue worshippers. Dura Europos is the largest and most important collection of Jewish art to survive from antiquity. Synagogues reflected the power and status of the local Jewish community, and the synagogue at Sardis, Turkey, is the largest and grandest ancient synagogue discovered. Here is where it is located. The main hall could accommodate over 1,000 people. 9 of the synagogue donors were members of the city council, and 3 donors were members of the Roman administration. Built in the 3rd and 4th centuries, the synagogue has a courtyard, a triple entrance, and 2 aedicular shrines, and a raised bema in the center of the sanctuary. The floor was mosaic, the walls marble, and the ceilings painted. Let's take a look.
Anatolia has one of the oldest and largest synagogues in the world. It was built in the 3rd century. Its size and splendor show how well the Jews lived in Roman times. It is an eye-catching structure with a capacity of approximately 1,000 people, 50 meters long, 164 feet, 14 meters high, 45 feet, with a vase-shaped fountain at the entrance. The floors are covered with magnificent mosaics, and the walls are decorated with patterned marble panels. Discovered in 1962, this synagogue is the Sardis Synagogue near Salihli, a district of Manisa in the Aegean region.
The building was part of a large gymnasium and public bath complex in the very heart of town. In general, Jews lived well in late antiquity, just like the Talmud suggested. The synagogue was a center of public life for all Sardi until the city was destroyed by the Persians in the 7th century. In the late 4th century CE, Rome broke apart into a Western Empire centered in Rome and an Eastern Empire centered in Byzantium, or Constantinople, which is today's Istanbul, Turkey. In the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire declined and Rome was sacked by Germanic tribes. After the Western Empire fell, Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire, became the protector of Christianity. Byzantium began as a Greek colony 1,000 years earlier in the 7th century BCE, and its language and culture were Greek. The land of Israel lay in the heart of the Byzantine Empire. Byzantium had power over the Middle East until the 7th century CE, when Jerusalem was captured by Islamic armies. Jews of the 3rd and 4th centuries were a thriving society, and a synagogue was often the largest building in the village, located at the best location, just as the Talmud suggested. The early church, however, could not tolerate Jews' good fortune. Once Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire, in the 4th and 5th centuries CE, synagogues became objects of attack. The church prohibited conversion to Judaism and inflamed anti-Semitism. New laws forbid Jews from building new synagogues. Local authorities demanded that synagogues not disturb passersby so walls were erected around synagogues to prevent onlookers from seeing or hearing the services. Jews became cautious, and the exterior of the synagogue building was kept plain and inconspicuous. The splendor of the synagogue building was concentrated in the interior space and the mosaic pavements. In ancient synagogues, women participated in synagogue services. There is no evidence for the forced separation of women into a special area or balcony. The exclusion of women from synagogue life was a medieval development. The synagogue began as a house of assembly, a Beit Knesset, and a house of study, a Beit Midrash, probably during the Babylonian exile. But after the temple was destroyed, it also became a house of prayer, a Beit Tefillah, and it became the center of social and religious life of the Jewish people. The synagogue made it possible for Judaism to adapt to a religious world where the temple no longer stood and priests no longer offered sacrifices. This synagogue timeline ends today's program. The future second session will begin in medieval times and continue through the Jewish Enlightenment and Jewish emancipation in the 19th century. This session will discuss medieval, Renaissance, and wooden Polish synagogues, along with the grand synagogues built in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The session will conclude with the Holocaust. The top two photographs are of a 17th century wooden Polish synagogue with its reconstructed, magnificent interior paintings. On the bottom left is the lavish interior of the 16th century Spanish synagogue, the largest and best-known synagogue in Venice, Italy. On the bottom right is the Doheny Synagogue in Budapest, Hungary, the largest synagogue in Europe and the third largest in the world. It was built in the mid-19th century and served as a symbol of the thriving Jewish community in Budapest, Hungary. We can see two large pillars topped with huge pomegranates, just like in Solomon's temple. The third session will explore early American synagogues and conclude with modern synagogues in Europe and in America, like this 1950s synagogue in Pennsylvania, designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. Here is the bibliography for today's program. This ends today's presentation. Thank you for attending.